That's really cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess I want to spend just a little bit more time on this, and then we can push on into some more kind of philosophy. So I want to take a bit of a sort of I guess, a step into sort of history and theology. If we look at the Old Testament, there's a kind of a really famous story of basically Saul going to a witch to call on the sort of spirit of Samuel to get advice for what's going on. He gets condemned for doing that, and then you kind of see this idea of sort of Sheol and souls kind of progressing throughout the sort of Hebrew Bible, and then moving into the New Testament. You kind of see this sort of this desire to talk and make sure it's being really, really clear that we're both physical and spiritual beings. And I kind of feel like they were obviously writing at the time against Gnosticism, this idea that kind of there is this sort of knowledge, or there's this sort of spiritual realm that is way more important than the physical. The physical is almost kind of rubbish and useless, and we should be chasing and seeking this spiritual extra thing. So I kind of feel like sometimes the New Testament authors are writing in a way to make it clear that no, it's both physical and spiritual or soul. And that kind of gives a little bit of wiggle room for New Testament scholars of certain stripes to begin to try and play down this notion of soul. And you kind of mentioned N.T. Wright. I'm a big N.T. Wright fan. My degree's in theology. I love a lot of his work, but you're absolutely right. He consistently kind of plays down this idea of a sort of kind of classic divide between the physical and the soul, and kind of tries to spin it in a different way that kind of aligns it nicely with the New Testament, and also kind of pushes back against Gnosticism or other sort of heresies that the New Testament was trying to fight against. But also kind of seems to be that he's also completely unaware or oblivious of philosophy of mind, and kind of he seems to be stepping into an almost like a I don't know, like he's kind of being a little bit kind of playing his cards covered up, like he's trying to almost appeal to a materialistic stance. I don't know. I kind of feel like a lot of people are trying to suggest that it isn't true that there is this substance dualism motif in something like the New Testament, because it's going to enable them to reach a wider audience, or the audience are going to read their works and scoff less, potentially. I don't know. Do you think that's why we have property dualism? It's kind of come out of a post World War One, World War Two era where there was a massive disenfranchisement with the whole sort of kind of Western empire or project, shall we say, Christendom coming to the fore, and this massive event took place which made people realize the harrowing nature of reality, of death, of sacrifice, of these things. And as that began to unravel, it seems to be that we're kind of pushing back further and further against these motifs. I don't know, I've thrown a lot of pieces at you just there, but I'd love to get your thought on why it is that people seem so hesitant, even when their traditions support it, to reject something like substance dualism.
Yeah, that's you touched on at least two, I think, somewhat distinct things there that I'll try and comment on. The first is yeah, New Testament scholars, Christian theologians, who are like that. That's one cohort that if you're a substance dualist, you might expect would be on your side, but they're the most vocal among them in the English language literature today. I think this is also true of German theology to a significant degree. Are not. They tend to defend either Christian materialism or as N.T. Wright does, just really de-emphasize any apparent mind-body or soul-body dualism. One reason, well, as you say, one strategy for doing that is to emphasize the anti-Gnostic thinking within early Christian reflection on human nature and the elements of scripture that draws on. And I think there's something important and interesting there. I want to say something like this is the case. There exists a very, very old outlook on reality according to which the material world and embodiment is essentially a misfortune that one wants to escape from. This is something that I think probably in the written record goes back to early Indian philosophical and religious traditions. So you get, the we're stuck in samsara. There's the cycle of reincarnation, and the goal is to escape that cycle and attain moksha, where you're not going to get reincarnated again. You get another version of that idea in Buddhism, and you get the same idea in, well, probably in the Orphics and Pythagoreans, so far as we can tell, and certainly in Plato. That doesn't seem to be a coincidence. There's good reason to think that the Orphic, Pythagorean, and Platonic traditions are influenced ultimately by the somewhat earlier Indian tradition, probably via Jain merchants who would be traveling sort of through Persia towards Greek-speaking Eurasia. And therefore, like early Jewish and Christian thinkers wanted to oppose, like they definitely do oppose, a tradition which not only draws a distinction between the body and the immaterial mind or soul, but strongly condemns one of these as bad and affirms the other as good, and identifies the goal we should be seeking towards as escape from the body, which is a kind of prison. Now, I think it's totally legitimate and interesting to emphasize that big difference between early Jewish and Christian thought and the pre-existing Platonic and Dharmic traditions. However, it just does not follow from the fact that the Christian thinkers affirm both soul and body as ultimately good, if albeit corrupted by the fall. It just does not follow that they have any, they are at all resistant to the distinction between the two, or indeed that they don't think that distinction is tremendously important. And in fact, the early Christian theologians, the church fathers, with almost no exception, certainly do embrace that distinction, think it's important, and there's very clear evidence for an affirmation of that distinction among intertestamental Jews, the Pharisees, Hellenized Jews, certainly not necessarily the Sadducees, and in the New Testament, and in some books of the Old Testament, which I think doesn't see this as, it's not central, the body-soul distinction, to the theology of the Old Testament in the way it becomes by, I think, the New Testament, early Christianity. But that, theological importance is a different matter to just what the understanding of human nature is metaphysically, irrespective of what is of spiritual importance. So I think that this strategy is illegitimate. It's pointing to something true, important, fascinating about past human thought, but it's not even really, I don't think N.T. Wright tries to infer, therefore they don't believe in an immaterial soul because they don't think that matter is evil or whatever. But I do think he and other scholars sometimes obfuscate the difference between these positions in order to play down the importance of the immaterial soul, as you suggested. Now, the other thing you said was okay, so is this where property dualism is coming from, a kind of embarrassment about the idea of endorsing an immaterial soul? But of course, the contemporary source of that embarrassment isn't actually the hosts of Gnostics filling our academic institutions. People often will like to pretend they think everyone they disagree with is ultimately a Gnostic of some kind. Maybe there's some insight there to be found somewhere, but certainly not explicit Gnostics. Really, the opponents tend to be materialists who are scientific naturalists who don't endorse the existence of God, an immaterial soul, a spiritual dimension to reality of any kind that can't be reduced to what we describe in natural science. And so I think a motivation that is also driving people to avoid embracing, or at least to de-emphasize, anything that looks like substance dualism is that this feels embarrassing in an intellectual culture that tends to presuppose scientific naturalism.
If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.